Last time I said I wasn't able to recall PlayStation 2 games because it looked like burnt vomit through an OSSC and because it looked like discoloured sandwich paste through a cheap metal box upscaler. Well, with the purchase of a £30 cable from Retro Gaming Cables, that can very quickly change, as now I can review PlayStation 2 games and put them through an OSSC and actually make them look somewhat decent. So let's start by having a look at one of the more notable properties from the early PlayStation 2 era. Don't worry, we'll keep with the theme of mechs. 1998 saw the international recognition of Hideo Kojima as a game direction powerhouse, with Metal Gear Solid releasing on the PlayStation and receiving quite a lot of praise at the time, although most of the praise would come retrospectively. Reviewers of the time criticised the game's gameplay to cinematic ratio as something of a problem, but the way the game itself was built, the storytelling and the ways in which Kojima and his team utilised every piece of hardware the PlayStation could provide were all sources of praise, and a sequel was undoubtedly to follow. It was around this time that another team within Konami were trying to make a game that was about fast-paced mecha action. Initially, the game was to be developed for the PlayStation and PC, but Konami had other plans and decided it would be a good fit as a launch title for the PlayStation 2. Whilst I did mention Hideo Kojima earlier, it should be noted that he served more as a producer on the project, but it was around this time that he was working far more heavily on the development of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. He did, however, assist in the game's creation, both as a way to show what he could do outside of games of his own design, as well as working on a game that he could leverage, as we'll mention soon. The box art for the game varies from region to region. America got a pretty neat orange and blue shaded cover with a mech as the primary thing on showcase. Europe got a really weird mishmash of ideas, including a mech that appears to be on Viagra, as well as an unfortunate facial expression and proportions for a character. And Japan got this, a sepia-toned cover with two children in the foreground with the game's logo and producer's stamp cast over a silhouette of a mech. This might be one of those weird instances where my favourite of the box arts comes from America because the shading gives it an imposing tone. The box art for this doesn't really sell it to me. The logo is well contrasted against the lighter parts of the box art, but the character designs, I must be honest, don't appeal to me. The early 2000s were a dodgy time for character design as everything went digital for anime. On the back of the box we don't really see much. It's arranged in much the same way other Konami games were at the time, particularly those with Kojima's involvement. We do get information on some of the individuals involved, however. The first line basically tells us Hideo Kojima worked as producer on the game. The second tells us the character designer was Nobuyoshi Nishimura. Nishimura worked primarily as an animator, with his work consisting of projects like Dirty Pair, Project Eden, and Mobile Suit Gundam Wing before becoming a character designer for After-War Gundam X. The third line tells us Metal Gear Solid's primary artist, Yoji Shinkawa, designed the mechs in this game, and given his track record for rather distinctive militaristic designs, it won't be too difficult to see his touch on the game. Inside there's demo disc for Metal Gear Solid 2? Ah yeah, this is where I talk about leverage. You see, Zone of the Enders would likely have never sold nearly as well as it did had the game not been used effectively as a marketing tool for the upcoming Metal Gear Solid 2. The hype for that game cannot be understated, as Metal Gear Solid was a milestone for the PlayStation, and a good chunk of people, desperate to get their hands on anything, would go out and buy Zone of the Enders because it had a demo for the game on a separate disc. That's some pretty solid marketing, I have to say. So much so, in fact, that in the last decade, Konami and even Capcom tried this trick, with Konami releasing the HD collection for Zone of the Enders with a demo for Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, whilst Capcom used Dragon's Dogma to try and convince people to buy Resident Evil 6. Oh dear. For now, we'll focus on Zone of the Enders specifically, so let's have a look in the manual. It's rather simple. It opens with some story information combined with a bunch of advice in the form of screenshots and some text describing each function. It doesn't have all that much stuff in it that you won't either figure out from playing the game or defer from the situation at hand. There are also some character profiles combined with some information on some mechs in the back, combined with some safety information. There isn't a lot here other than the stuff that would need to be here to justify being printed. You can get by without the manual though, as a lot of the things explained here can be learned or adjusted to within the game itself. So enough dawdling, why don't we just start the game up? We start the game up with an opening cinematic that plays with one of my favourite pieces of music in the game. So much so in fact that when I did uploads of awesome video game music, this was among them. Outside of that, it's a bunch of out of context scenes in the game, so to avoid being spoiled on what's in it, let's move on. Oh yeah, I should point out, spoiler alert! I will be talking about the game inside and out and showcasing basically all of the story. So if you have not played this game before, consider this your warning. For now though, let us start the game. We'll be playing on normal difficulty for this. The game's story starts off with an invading force approaching the space colony Antilia, before we see a boy running away from all of the explosions before seeing a robot falling on top of his friends who may or may not have been bullying him. In any event, he stumbles into a hangar away from all of the death to see a giant robot in front of him. He is propelled towards it thanks to another explosion, and in getting up off of his feet, he ends up inside of the cockpit of the robot, which begins to undock itself. A robot blasts open a hole in the ceiling and drops in, and before we had even given the opportunity to take it out on a date and get dinner together, we're dropped straight into a battle with it before the game even tells us how to play. Once we defeat this robot, however, we are thrust right into a brief introduction to not only Leo, the main character, but also Jehuty, the main mech itself, and its artificial intelligence known as Ada. And then a tutorial happens. Start off, let's get the controls out of the way. The left stick moves Jehuty in whichever direction you move it. The camera is operated with the right stick. Square is attack. X and triangle move you vertically. R2 allows you to dash while moving or charge up a burst attack while stationary. R1 guards. L2 allows you to lock on or change target. And L1 disengages the lock on to allow you to escape. There are some extra things underneath all of this however. For instance, the mode of attack will depend on your proximity to the opponent. If you are near an enemy, you'll attack with your arm blade, whilst being distant results in shots being fired in their direction. The game does, however, tend to favour getting up close and personal, so bear that in mind, on account of the damage that you can do by repeatedly pressing square when you're next to an opponent, dealing a lot of damage quite quickly. The R2 moveset is also quite complex. R2 will allow you to dash if you're moving, or charge up if not. If you dash while pressing square, you'll set off homing lasers, or cut up an enemy in a nothing personnel kit kind of fashion. The burst attack works in two ways, again depending on proximity. If you are in slashing distance, you'll perform a circular slash which breaks through guards, much like how Link does in many a Legend of Zelda game. If you're away from them, you'll fire off an unblockable, highly powerful burst of energy that can sometimes one-hit enemies. Once we have the fundamentals down, we're thrust back into battle with two pairs of enemies until, suddenly, a red robot with a triangular head enters the picture. The pilot within it is surprised at the fact that she's fighting a boy, but we lay down the smackdown until she's forced to retreat. Leo, however, freaks out at the fact that his friends are dead and that everything around him is on fire, before we are contacted by someone aboard the transport vessel Atlantis called Elena. She gives us the task of finding our way to the other side of the colony and deliver Jehuty to them. Leo, however, is reticent to agree until Elena makes him realise that he either brings the robot to her or more people will be killed. He finally agrees on the condition that he doesn't have to kill anyone. Ada informs us of a local server with what appears to be an information screen as a pause menu within the server, which allows us to leave the current area and go elsewhere on the colony. Once we do, we go straight towards the town Leo comes from after we find that it is on fire. We land to find a young girl running on the streets. We drop down and talk to her and ask her why she's running around, and it turns out she's trying to get to the church. We, however, have a big fryer to fish. Hang on a second, that's not right. This big old boss monster of a machine called Tempest is burning the town to a cinder. Naturally, we have the objective of taking this machine down, but as I go into this, I just want to discuss the game's performance briefly. The game runs natively at 60 fields per second. Note how I say fields and not frames. due to the nature of this game being played in a 480i resolution, and a field accounts basically for all the odd number lines or even number lines of an image. In any event, it runs smoothly, although this battle does show some rather nasty slowdown. Throughout most of the game, however, you won't really notice all that many problems crop up when it comes down to performance. Now that we've grabbed the girl called Selvice back from the church, she hops into the cockpit and we get on going on our journey to the other side, but not before accessing another server to acquire a sub-weapon. However, we have the first of a few SOS missions before us. These are primarily optional side missions which can affect your result at the end of the game if you do them well. The objective in these missions is to destroy all the enemies in the area with as little damage to the property or loss of life. You need to be able to calculate risks on the fly and be able to kite enemies away from anything that can blow up. Whilst I'm good at maths, risk assessment was never a part of the curriculum for me, so naturally I'm kinda bad at this. Once Selvice is done chastising us, we make our way over to where we started again, as there is a server nearby which contains some data about the colony itself, which allows Ada to draw up a mission plan. To cut a long story short, our objective is to deactivate the colony shaft, which is powering a force field preventing us from progressing further, with 2 further EPS generators creating a massive impenetrable wall hindering our progress also, meaning we have to take care of those as well. This is where the game starts to open up a bit, and whilst it isn't necessarily bad that a game opens up in a vaguely non-linear fashion, it does expect you to deal with situations as they come, and it's still very linear. The only difference really is that it allows you to get lost. This becomes a bit of an impediment later, but for now we have just a few different places to go to, starting with the town in which we picked Selvice up from the church, given there's an SOS signal now. The objective here is very simple: ensure the church remains intact. So naturally, my dumbass decided it'd be a good idea to fight near the church. The game is being very generous with the E ranking. Oh well, I probably did some religion a favour. So now that I'm trying to justify negligent manslaughter, we stumble our way Karadzic style over to the colony shaft, where we are met with an impenetrable barrier and a spinny thing with white dots on it. We can't get at it right now, as we need a new sub-weapon, which requires us to go back to one of the towns. For now though, let's talk about the graphics. There are 2 things I should talk about regarding the graphics. Firstly, it's the graphics during gameplay and in-engine cinematics, and secondly, I'll make mention of the pre-rendered cinematics. So the graphics in the game themselves are more about art style than they are about actual texture and model quality. All of the robots in the game look pretty good visually for an early PS2 game, and some of the effects like the stealth camouflage look really nice. However, most of the environments look very samey and indistinct, so much so that whilst everything looks like what it's supposed to represent, it doesn't exactly impress outside of that. It's a bit bland environmentally speaking. As for the cutscenes, well, they have not aged well visually. The weird glazed look of 3D-ified anime in 2001 didn't really help the game in the long run, because it looks quite outdated by comparison to what we have now. They also have some weird camera work going on in them. Some shots are pretty well composed, but whenever something resembling action is going on, the camera seems to go slightly mad. Perhaps it would also be a good time to talk about the audio in the game as well. Not being Japanese, my ability to judge the voice acting in this language is somewhat restricted, but I don't think, generally speaking, it's half bad. I've heard a lot of complaints about the voiceover in the English version of the game, and I kind of agree, but most of it comes down to Leo being the character we hear the most, and his voice actor being rather squeaky at the time. Everyone else is mostly fine in my opinion. So not really knowing how to judge the voice acting, how about the music? The music is quite nicely varied, though mostly it's some variety of electronic music, all composed by a fair few performers. Featuring work by Maki Kirioka, Akihiro Honda, Norihiko Hibino, Toshiyuki Kakuta, and Shuichi Kobori, the soundtrack varies in the game, and as the situation has changed, the music can intensify, as helped by the way the PlayStation 2 handles music. A lot of the music in this game is pretty good, with one of the standouts being the boss battle music. That being said, it is a soundtrack that's more about being appropriate for the situation than it is about wanting to listen to it every now and again. Anyway, now that we've gone back to a town, we are greeted with a new mechanic. Glowing purple pods, called porters, will appear in some zones. Basically, blow all of them up and you'll unlock a red box with an item inside it. With this, we get the sub-weapon we need, Sniper. We go back to the shaft and shoot the pods one by one with the sniper weapon. And oh come on, that was almost at the last one! Oh, someone else had to come in and join in the fun, eh? Now that all of the party crashers have been escorted off the premises, I can now shoot the last of the colony shaft's zits and blow it up. Now that it's no longer powered up, we can go to the other enemies over there and kill them, nab a password, get another sub-weapon, and leave. And before we continue, there's just no avoiding this anymore, is there? We have to address the elephant in the room, and that is the mecha design. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with the design itself. Jehuty, in fact, is one of my favourite mechs, especially in terms of design. But there's one very notable aspect of it that is impossible to ignore, and that is the cockpit. Mech designer Yoji Shinkawa decided that it would be funny if the cockpit was somewhat literal, considering it is located on the crotch, and when Jehuty changes to flight mode, the cockpit becomes erect. Oh, Jesus Christ. Anyway, we now have 2 EPS generators to take care of. We go to deal with the first one and destroy a bunch of robots. We then find a passageway down to where a generator might be. Every step of the way though, yet more robots appear to be a bit of a nuisance, and now might be a good time to talk about them. You've already seen all the varieties of normal enemy in the game. You have the usual grunt enemies called raptors. You then have enemies with what amounts to a shield being given to raptors as a means of defense called mummy heads, and bulky, close quarters combat focused enemies called cyclops. They're all distinct enough that you'll know what to expect with each one, but I would hesitate to say that it doesn't get boring after a little while. You only have 3 types of enemies for the entire game. That being said, there are a few modifiers to apply here. First of all is the level of each squad and enemy, as well as yourself. You gain experience for each enemy destroyed, with level 8 being the highest for Jehuty, each making your attacks more powerful and bumping your health up slightly. Just as it does for you, however, the higher level the enemies have, the more powerful and more varied their attacks become. Mummy heads, for example, don't have a laser attack at level 1 or 2, but come level 3, you'll be keeping an eye out for that laser. It certainly does what it can to make the enemies more varied, even though the enemy variety itself is as thin as pub whiskey. Nonetheless, it does what it can to make things interesting with as few ingredients in the larder. There are a couple more modifiers that are enemy specific as well, but we'll get to those when it's appropriate. For now though, after dealing with all these enemies, we find the generator and blow it up. Now we just need to go to the other generator and... oh, there's another force field here. Thankfully, Ada comes up with a plan to hijack control of an enemy raptor and use that to get through this shield. We do what we can to find these passcodes to get access to a control program so that we can use the raptor in one of the towns from earlier. Playing as the raptor is a little bit weird. It's a little bit slower and its attacks are a lot simpler, in that shots are replaced with the javelin sub-weapon and charging attacks only does so much. Nonetheless, we can get past a shield that Jehuty can't. We deal with a bunch of enemies and find a wall to the generator room. We can't do anything with it yet because we need to find a nearby server with a program that allows us to detect things that would otherwise be impossible to see. Now we can access the generator room and blow the thing up. Once we do that, we lose control of the robot, but we'll need to come back to it soon anyway because of it having the detector program installed. For now though, another town needs our help because it's being invaded by Gribblies. We drop in on the raptor with our detector installed and we wreck it and get the detector back. We immediately put it to use as there is a series of once invisible porters right outside the passageway that we can destroy and get the password to a local server for a new sub-weapon. Now we make our way onwards towards the dam at the other end of the colony, and Ada comments on another factory area before, all of a sudden, we are shot down by another enemy. It's a big brute that we can't confidently battle against on account of its attacks locking onto us, but more to the point, we have no health, and Jehuty has been corrupted by a virus. We leave the area sharpish to go to the factory Ada mentioned to discover that we can't even restore Jehuty's integrity. We have to find a vaccine program. To do that, we blow up the porters in this area and do what we can to endure the stressfulness that is staying out of the way of other robots. Unfortunately, I got a game over here because, and I'm not joking here, my controller decided to die on me for a second. This thing is the controller equivalent of Lazarus if Lazarus was subject to RNGesus. Never mind, we soldier on with a more consistent controller that, For some reason I can't press the start button on, meaning I have to unplug and replug the controller whenever I need to access the pause menu. Hilarious. I really need a new controller. Anyway, we got the password for a local server, so we go to it and we have to deal with another enemy. We blow it up, access the server, and all of a sudden we are good and dry. Now what? We can't reliably take on that thing yet, because we need a way of distracting it in order to avoid its attacks. For now though, we have to go back to the pillar, as the enemy is trying to destroy the shaft and destabilise the colony. Not on our watch, as we clear this place out perfectly. Now that we've dealt with them, we now have to do a rather obscene level of backtracking. This is the part where the game loses steam rather dramatically, because if there's one thing I'm not really a fan of here, it's the backtracking. Now, to a very slight degree, it's perhaps understandable why they implemented it, in that there are extra sub-weapons you can acquire if you rummage around, but I seldom ever end up using them, and in all, it starts to get boring, frankly. It does the pacing of the game no favours, and I'm only after the goddamn decoy here. Well, we found our way to the third town again to discover some enemies have stealth camouflage enabled. Fortunately for us, we can deal with that because Jehuty, quite literally, sees through their subterfuge. Perhaps I ought to go into the modifiers for enemies, now that there's a reason to do so. So when you're bumbling about in an area, you'll see squads of 2 or 3 robots, with a difficulty level associated with them, and sometimes another designation. Of the 2, the asterisk is more common, referring to the squad having a leader that essentially morale boosts the other enemies. Decapitate the leader and all of a sudden you're fighting grunts from Halo. The other modifier is written as S. If this walkthrough I found is any indicator, it refers to a special class squad, meaning they are particularly difficult. I can't say I had any real difficulty with them though, and they went down easy enough. Usually those with asterisks and S's will carry something useful like Metatron, sub-weapon ammo or a passcode for a server. In this instance, we find the passcode we need for Decoy. Now we can fight the Tyrant. And this dude is no pushover. Its first form isn't terribly difficult, but it transforms into something you'd see in a side-scrolling shooter. It has a tendency to ram into us and fire lasers at us and the like. This second phase is rather tricky and we end up in the red with our energy quite easily. We do, however, manage to wreck its face before we end up being destroyed. Doing this appears to have deactivated pretty much every single one of the enemy forces around the parts of the colony we've been so far. Now that we've done that, we move towards the mountain where we are contacted by Elena. This time she has a friend along called Rock Thunderheart. That has to be added alongside the list of names like Stick Brightling, Edge Maverick and, for a real life example, Racing Gardener, as examples of names that sound really cool but are actually really stupid. In any event, Rock tells us that we need to go through the dam at the end of the mountain to access a warehouse where you and he will meet up and drop Jehuty off. And Leo, once again, has a moment where he's just sick of everyone ordering him around and trying to destroy robots. Rock, however, lays a verbal smackdown on him once Leo goes a step too far by mentioning the name of the pilot who was supposed to be piloting Jehuty, but died before doing so. Leo ultimately does another 180 and realises that maybe destroying unmanned enemies isn't necessarily a bad thing to do, when all it does on your end is leave you with a bunch of scrap metal to deal with. Moving on from this episode, we fire up Jehuty to go to the dam, but before we can do that we're being shot at from way above, meaning we'll have to take the route with as much cover as possible, meaning we'll have to navigate the valleys and the mountain. This place is a bit of a maze, meaning navigation here with the map and the pause menu is pretty important. As I mentioned already, I can't use the pause menu unless I unplug and replug the controller, for some strange reason, but we managed to stumble our way around. We also find our last sub-weapon here, and perhaps now would be a good time to talk about the problems that I have with the sub-weapons and why, in this playthrough, I haven't really used them. There are 10 sub-weapons, each fulfilling a different purpose to one another. Javelin launches a projectile that damages, Phalanx is a machine gun whose spread changes depending on how hard you press the button, Sniper is a precision weapon, Halberd is a laser that locks you in place, Comet is a highly damaging homing projectile, Gauntlet is a forceful attack that propels an enemy backwards, and Bounder exists. There's also Geyser, which works as a set of mines which detonate when something triggers the lasers, Decoy projects a hologram of Jehuty which distracts enemy radar and lock-on systems, and Mummy, which serves as a shield behind which you can recover lost energy. Sounds varied, doesn't it? Well, variety is a good thing about this list of items, but you know what would be good? Having a reason to use much of this stuff. I've used every single one of these sub-weapons, and with the exceptions of Decoy, Mummy, Gauntlet and Halberd, I can't think of a single reason to really use any of them. They exist, but only really to fill out a list of things a player can get. Not only that, but you get an obscene amount of ammunition for some of these sub-weapons that you can't even really use. In what world am I going to be able to use 3,000 rounds of phalanx ammo? And when we enter the mountain area, what do we find? Ammo caches that supply 3 weapons at a time. In any event, we'll need to go through the valleys to get through to the dam at the end. As I mentioned, the navigation aspect is quite important, and a lot of enemies can appear. By this point you'll have reached max level, so fighting them is basically a formality, but whatever. We find our way to the dam, where another boss comes to greet us, Nebula. This dude is similarly brutal to Tyrant, but with the added bonus of turning this place into a bullet hell. The tried and true method of burst attacking does you some favours, but avoiding all the attacks it throws at you is something that can be the difference between you living and dying. There is one problem I have with this battle, however. There are solid objects in this area that can impede you and leave you vulnerable. Fortunately I avoided being hit because of it, but it's not something you want to be caught with your pants down over. Whatever, we destroy this thing, it turns into a light show, and the pilot buggers off. Rock contacts us again, telling us to go through the dam where... oh boy, we're getting a thing telling us to save? Someone is waiting for us in the warehouse, and it's the Goddess of War herself. Everything in this place is destructible cover, so use that to your advantage whenever possible, and you'll actually have half a reason to use the sub-weapons in your arsenal. Eventually she will ensnare you and hold you fast, resulting in Leo and Ada having a fight against one another until Leo can wrest control of Jehuty once again. Once that's over, the battle gets back underway. This is a really tricky battle, and for as many issues as I've had with the sub-weapons in this game up to this point, it at least gives you a decent reason to use them now. Though they could have given me a reason perhaps a few hours ago. Gauntlet, Mummy, Decoy and Comet will serve you quite well here. Once we've disarmed, literally, and immobilised Neat, Viola forces Leo into considering landing a killing blow on her. And Leo hesitates. Viola warns him about doing that, but for now, she can't do anything. Rock is there to meet us, and we drop Jehuty off. Or not, because Rock informs us that we have to go to the spaceport on the colony and disarm a bunch of bombs that have been armed, lest Antilia ends up falling to Jupiter. Leo is just done with all of this and doesn't want to participate in any more combat, but Selvies convinces him to do so, though not just by talking to him. She gets shot, because Viola is nothing if not a woman of her word. Actual personal tragedy seems to be the only thing motivating Leo at this point, so Leo ends up leaving Selvies with Rock for the moment and going to the spaceport with Jehuty to deal with the bombs. Along the way there, however, we find ourselves in conversation with Ada for a few minutes about Leo's own backstory and parental troubles. But right now, we have a rather important job to do. Or two, really. Firstly, we have to disarm a bunch of bombs once we find them, or blow them up ourselves because we're stupid like that. These things do a lot of damage if you're near them, so exercise caution when you're around them, and make sure no enemies are close to you whilst you grab the bombs and disarm them. After a few have been disarmed, we enter a battle with Viola once more, this time piloting a zombified Neat with all sorts of bits hovering around it. She's still a handful, even with half the robot destroyed. She's also very fast in this phase, but ultimately she's barely able to function at her peak because, well, only Bloodlust and Vitriol is holding that thing together. It isn't enough to beat us, and is pushed to the wall of the spaceport towards Jupiter. A bomb explodes, destroying some of the wall and forcing Neat out of the port and on a gravitational crash course for Jupiter. Leo continues with his naive bullshit, however, coming up with plans to save Viola, who was not only aggressive towards him, but also to his friend. Viola thought she instilled the idea of revenge in him, but he still wanted to save her. As Viola falls to Jupiter's gravity, she chides Leo over his wanting to save a woman who lost everything and exists solely as a killing machine, just so that she herself may die. Leo, refusing to kill, kind of gets in the way of that idea. After a few minutes, Neat falls ever further into Jupiter's atmosphere and burns up upon re-entry. But all of a sudden, Jehuty begins resonating. Jehuty's equal, Anubis, shows up, with the leader of the invading force piloting it. You enter combat with it just a few moments later, but beating it is impossible, due to Anubis being so much more powerful. Your only option, right now, is to survive. Elena contacts you to say that she'll blow a hole in the wall at a spaceport to enable you to escape. After a few seconds, you escape, leaving Anubis behind in the spaceport and Jehuty on course to being delivered to Atlantis. After stowing away on Atlantis, Ada and Leo prepare to part ways, but Ada delivers one final bombshell before Leo gets out. Ada confirms the mission Jehuty must perform, as it is headed to Mars to be detonated as a bomb. Leo, hugely upset by this, leaves the hatch after effectively saying goodbye to it. He is soon greeted by Elena, Rock and Selvice, the latter of whom is laying on a gurney after receiving a bit of medical treatment, and credits. This game in its entirety took around 4.5 hours in terms of how much footage I needed to record for it. In a way, I'm thankful that games like these are quite short because it makes going back to them easier. On the other hand, however, the game was trying to stretch out its length to such a ridiculous degree that it stretched it too thin and ultimately made it slightly less enjoyable by the end. And even though I do really like the game, I can't really say that it's paced all that well. However, if you know what you're doing, you should be able to beat the game in a little over 3 hours. Maybe less if you skip all the cutscenes like a barbarian, or if you're a speedrunner, you can beat the game in half an hour. On the whole, the game is very solid. The core of its gameplay is very enjoyable and fun, and the game's general design is well applied. The only problems I have with it are the backtracking, which killed the pacing somewhat, and the flimsiness of the sub-weapons. Outside of that, it's visually pretty good, its soundtrack is good, audio design is alright, and the presentation is pretty neat for 2001. So on the whole, I do recommend this game. Owing to its zippy combat, and if you can get over the weird looking cutscenes, you're going to have a blast. If you love mecha action, this is a must-have. Now, this is the part where ordinarily I would talk about other releases of the game. However, there is only one re-release of the original game, that being on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 as part of the Zone of the Enders HD collection. The port was released around the time where Konami were being especially funky with their properties. Whilst the Metal Gear Solid HD collection was excellent, the Silent Hill HD collection was an atrocity upon mankind. Zone of the Enders HD collection kind of sits in between the two, in that the resolution goes up and the general quality of the game is somewhat like it is on the PlayStation 2, but the remaster introduces some problems to the original game that it didn't have, or at least not to the same degree. Performance issues and aliasing are serious enough that it may make you think twice about going for it. It is still perfectly playable, but on the whole you are having to pick between higher resolution or more stability. Now, if there's a HD collection, that must mean that there's more than one game to this franchise, and indeed there is. But there's more to the franchise than just the games, and in fact in the early 2000s it had works in multiple mediums. The first game released with a premium package version which included an hour-long animation called ZOE 2167 Idolo, which takes place 5 years prior to the game and released on DVD everywhere outside of the premium package. A 26-episode animation was also made and aired throughout 2001, animated by Sunrise, called ZOE Dolores I, taking place around the time of the game itself, with half of the series taking place before and the other half taking place after. Outside of that, a spin-off game was released for the Game Boy Advance, known in the West as Zone of the Enders The Fist of Mars, and in Japan as ZOE 2173 Testament. Its gameplay is similar in style to Super Robot Wars and Advance Wars. And there is also the matter of the game's sequel, Zone of the Enders, the second runner. And perhaps a double bill is in order? Zone of the Enders was an interesting game for the time, and even though its success could be arguably attributed to it being an advertising mural for Metal Gear Solid 2 The Sons of Liberty, it does have its own merits. But with that in mind, I've been Daniel Earmouth. Today.